Hello again, 102. In this video, we will begin looking at the strategies and achievements of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And this is a very long section, and we will do this in two parts. During the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., became the face and the heart of the civil rights movement. His goal was integration and equality, and he was an uplifting example of fortitude and dignity in confronting brutality and oppression. By nature, he was inspirational and courageous, with an astonishing capacity for forgiveness and a deep understanding of the dynamics of political power and social change. King was neither a genius nor a saint, but his shortcomings pale into insignificance when compared to his achievements. He was one of the world's most inspiring examples of courage, conviction, and dignity in the face of violent prejudice and persecution. With the help of those he led and inspired, King changed the trajectory of American history for the better. Alas, he did not live to see the promised land made possible by his actions. Sit-ins will be one of the strategies used. And this is the Greensboro 4. This is cut off a little bit at the bottom. Joseph McNeil from the left, Franklin McCain, Billy Smith, and Clarence Judson, I believe his last name is. Henderson, excuse me. They will use this tactic. On February the 1st, 1960, the clerk refused to serve them, explaining that blacks had to eat standing up or take their food outside. The Greensboro 4, as the students came to be called, waited for 45 minutes and then returned the next day with 24 more students, and along with others, they returned every day for a week, patiently tolerating being jeered at, jostled, and spat upon, or having food dumped over their heads by white hooligans. And the sit-in movement spread quickly to 6 more towns in the state. And within 2 months, similar sit-ins involving 50,000 blacks and whites, men and women, young and old, had occurred in over 100 cities in 13 states. Some 3,600 people had been arrested. Black comedian Dick Gregory participated in several sit-ins in whites-only restaurants. When the managers told him, "We don't serve Negroes," he replied, "No problem. I don't eat Negroes." By the end of July 1960s, officials in Greensboro lifted the whites-only policy at the Woolworth's lunch counter. The civil rights movement had found an effective new tactic: non-violent sit-ins against segregation. And that is the main strategy in the beginning of the 1960s, ladies and gentlemen. Non-violent civil disobedience, originated by Mahatma Gandhi and then used by Dr. King. In April 1960, some 200 college student activists, black and white, had converged in Raleigh, North Carolina, to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an interracial organization formed in 1960 with the goal of intensifying the effort to end racial segregation. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee broadened the sit-ins, which began at restaurants, to include kneel-ins at all-white churches and wade-ins at segregated public swimming pools. In many communities, demonstrators were pelted with rocks, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to unending verbal abuse, and even killed by white racists. As Florida hog farmer Holstead Haas Manussi explained to a journalist, "I ain't got no bad habits. Don't smoke, don't cuss. My only bad habit is fighting niggas." Freedom rides will be another strategy used. In 1961, civil rights leaders decided to put the movement on wheels by integrating public transportation, buses and trains. Their larger goal was to force the Kennedy administration to engage the cause of civil rights. And they were activists who traveled by bus through the South to test federal court rulings that banned segregation on buses and trains. And on May the 4th, the New York-based Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, led by James Farmer, sent a courageous group of 18 black and white Freedom Riders, as they were called, on 2 public buses from Washington, D.C. through the Lower South to New Orleans. Farmer warned Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy that the bus riders would probably be attacked as they traveled through the South, and the warning was well founded. They were firebombed in Alabama, and that's what's left of that bus, just a burnt shell. A few hours later, Freedom Riders on a second bus were beaten by whites armed with bats and chains after entering whites-only waiting rooms at the bus terminal in Birmingham. The police, as it turned out, had encouraged the beatings. Alabama's governors complained that the Freedom Riders were violating our laws and customs. The next day, the Freedom Riders wanted to continue their trip, but the bus drivers refused. When Diane Nash, a fearless black college student and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader in Nashville, Tennessee, heard about the violence in Birmingham, she recruited new riders. President Kennedy called her, warning that she would be killed if she did this, but she refused to back down. "It doesn't matter if we're killed," she told the president. "Others will come. Others will come." On May 17th, Nash and 10 students took a bus to Birmingham, where they were arrested, and while in jail, the students sang freedom songs. "We will never turn back, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, we shall overcome," and Eugene Bull Connor, the notoriously racist police chief, grew so frustrated at their joyous rebelliousness that he drove them in the middle of the night to the Tennessee state line and dropped them off to walk, saying, "I couldn't stand your singing." Instead of going to Nashville, however, the gutsy students returned to Birmingham. And President Kennedy was not inspired by the courageous Freedom Riders. To him, they were a pain in the ass, threatening to embarrass him and the United States on the eve of his summit meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The president and his brother Bobby dismissed the Freedom Riders as publicity seekers, and the Kennedys had no intention of promoting any civil rights legislation. The demonstrators persisted, finally forcing the president to provide another bus, which enabled them to renew the journey to New Orleans. And when a new group of Freedom Riders reached Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, white racists attacked them. The next night, civil rights activists gathered at a Montgomery church to honor the Freedom Riders, but their meeting was interrupted by a rampaging mob of whites armed with rocks and firebombs. Ministers made frantic appeals to the White House. President Kennedy responded by urging the Alabama governor to intervene. And after midnight, National Guardsmen arrived to disperse the mob. The Freedom Riders continued into Mississippi, where they were imprisoned, and they never made it to New Orleans. But they succeeded in their larger goal. This led the Interstate Commerce Commission in September 1961 to order the integration of interstate transportation facilities. James Meredith. In the fall of 1962, James Meredith was an African-American student and a United States Air Force veteran whose grandfather had been a slave. He tried to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi, Ole Miss in Oxford, and Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, described by Time magazine as bitter a racist as inhabits the nation, refused to allow Meredith to register for classes. The militantly stubborn Barnett breathed scorching defiance. He vowed to rot in jail before he will let one Negro ever darken the sacred threshold of our white schools. Robert Kennedy then dispatched federal marshals to enforce the law. When the marshals were assaulted by a white mob shouting, "Go to hell, JFK," President Kennedy sent National Guard troops, all white. The arrival of the soldiers on campus ignited rioting that left 2 dead and dozens injured. Once the violence subsided, however, James Meredith was a registered student at the university. Only in America a reporter noted, would the federal government send thousands of troops to enforce the right of an otherwise obscure citizen to attend a particular university? And Birmingham will be next. And we're going to stop here and pick this up in part 2. Several months later, in early 1963, Bull O'Connor will order the Birmingham police to unleash their dogs on demonstrators. Not a very sound tactic, Police Chief Connor.